Thank you, Dolphy. Good afternoon, friends. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to Moneylife Foundation's 7th anniversary program, and it's my privilege to introduce our two eminent speakers this afternoon. Allow me to start with the introduction of Mr. Jay Panda. Mr. Panda, one of the most conscientious, focused, and clear-headed MPs today, was born in a business family in Odisha and moved to the US at the age of 16, spending time in Michigan and New York, and eventually graduating from Michigan Technological University. With a background in engineering and management, he went on to work for the family business, but was troubled by the stifling license raj on the one hand and all-around poverty on the other. He told himself that he should stop complaining and do something about it. And soon, he started assisting the late Biju Patnaik, one of the tallest leaders of India in the pre- and the post-independence period. Subsequently, he worked with Mr. Navin Patnaik, who founded the Biju Janata Dal and entered public life as a politician to work towards efficient politics and better governance in India. Mr. Panda has been in the parliament for almost 17 years now. It doesn't seem so, right? He first entered the Rajya Sabha in 2000 and got elected to the upper house again in 2006. And from 2009, he has been a member of the Lok Sabha from the Kendrapara constituency. As a parliamentarian, he's been a member of many important committees like the Parliamentary Standing Committees on Finance, Home, Energy, and Urban Development. Currently, he's a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce as well as Consultative Committee for the Ministry of Human Resources Development. He holds a private pilot's license and often travels to his constituency in his helicopter, but he does not merely make an aerial survey over his state like other politicians do. He has actually used his helicopter to organize relief operations during floods and other natural calamities. Mr. Panda has started some interesting ways of communicating directly with the people of his constituency. One such scheme involves direct and frequent contact with his citizens. His Crisis Help Initiative offers help from his office to the victims in case of emergencies. The third idea, a postcard system, encourages his constituents to send their grievances directly to him by post. This is designed to allow citizens to bypass obstructive officials. One of the highlights of Mr. Panda's work was completing the Indupur Bridge connecting Kendrapara and Jajpur districts up and running. When Mr. Panda became the MP in 2009, barely 10% of the project work had been completed over 18 years. This is typical of public works project all over the country. He made innumerable visits to the site to keep up the pressure on the officers, conducted review meetings in the capital city, and got the project completed in 4 years. As a conscientious MP, Mr. Panda has been returning a part of his salary and daily allowances proportional to the time lost in Lok Sabha due to disruptions. Although he knows that this contribution is nothing compared to the huge amounts of money that is constantly being wasted. My conscience bothers me that we are taking all these benefits and not doing the job that we are elected to do, he says. Legislative changes are usually initiated by the government of the day, but they can also be introduced by MPs in their individual capacities. Mr. Panda has introduced a large number of private members' bills in the Parliament. One bill sought to expand the powers of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Another bill was to transfer cases involving elected representatives who are being tried across different courts in different parts of the country to fast-track courts, which shall complete the trial within 90 days from the date of filing the charge sheet. This was to prevent fake and politically motivated cases from dragging on endlessly. Mr. Panda has also been spearheading the campaign to reduce the consumption of tobacco products in India, which kill over 1 million people every year. Drawing upon the Australian example, he has introduced a bill to stipulate plain packaging of tobacco products and increase the size of health warning and the accompanying graphic to at least 60% of the package. This has been very, very successful. Besides being active in the Parliament and his constituency, Mr. Panda is an active member of the Citizens Alliance Against Malnutrition, a high-level advocacy group comprising young parliamentarians from different parties and other influences. The work of the Alliance prompted the Nandi Foundation to conduct the nation's first ever large-scale malnutrition survey in 2011. It captured nutrition data from over 100,000 children and more than 74,000 mothers. others. In one of his most important interventions, Mr. Panda followed up a press report about exploitation of migrant Odisha laborers in brick kilns of Andhra Pradesh in January 2013. He wrote to the National Human Rights Commission, the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, and the Labour Minister requesting them to investigate and ensure that the rights of the workers are protected. NHRC then directed the Chief Secretary, Government of Andhra Pradesh, to respond to the complaint with all the relevant information. In April, Mr. Panda himself visited the brick kilns of Rangareddy district to get a first-hand account of what's going on. Following this, a project titled Reducing Vulnerability to Bondage Through Promotion of Decent Work has been started in November 2012 with a budget of more than 2 crore to enumerate workers, enroll them in various government schemes, improving housing conditions, and provide education to Odia children on worksite schools. With these few words, we look forward to Mr. Panda's ideas of transforming India, especially through non-government initiatives. I now request Mr. Panda to come and please address us.
Mr. Krishnamurthy, Mr. Chavan, my colleague Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Sucheta and Devashish, distinguished delegates and attendees, it gives me great pleasure to be here on this occasion. First, I'd like to thank you for that I'm humbled by that introduction. That was very kind and, more importantly, extremely well-researched. Most of the time, introductions contain erroneous information or outdated information. Thank you again, but I would like to correct one minor error that crept into that. It said I'm a member of the Commerce Committee, and it is true I had been, without my consent, nominated to the Commerce Committee, but I refused to serve on it because of conflict of interest. And I serve on the Home Committee instead. But thank you very much. I want to start by sharing my favorite anecdote about politics. And this actually happened to me. I was asked by a young relative some years ago who was supposed to write a school essay about politics and was asked, "Uncle, would you please tell me something?" And I made the cardinal mistake of saying, "Please go and look it up on the internet." She came back and said with great delight that I found out that politics is not one word but two. Polle is Latin for many, and ticks, of course, are small blood-sucking insects. I disagree only with the small. This is not an atypical view of politics or politicians, and for good reason. And it is not just in India that people think irreverently about politicians. It's a global phenomenon in democracies, and it's a good thing. We wouldn't want to live in a country where we couldn't make fun of those that would rule us. Try living in North Korea. Try living in some other countries that have much better economic conditions. So, the theme of my talk today is going to be about democracy, about politics, and about some of the reforms that I think are crucial. Some of the reforms that I think can transform India. And here I want you to keep something in mind. Rajiv and I are not the typical politicians. We are in Parliament because of an unusual combination of circumstances and timing. We are, I believe, out-of-the-box thinkers because we are mavericks, because we haven't bought into the system as it exists. But I would say that the majority of our colleagues are status quoists. And it's important to understand this. And they are status quoists because they are in the position that they are, not despite the system, but because of it, either through family connections or through being in student politics, whatever it is the system as it functions today that has got them there, whereas in a few exceptional cases, we have come in laterally without being in family, being in politics, and still continue to think that the system needs change, because all of you, I'm sure, agree that the system needs change. Most of us inside the system don't think so. That needs to change first, before the system will change. So first, let's talk a little bit about democracy. You know, it often gets fashionable to talk down democracy, that our problems are due to democracy. And yes, indeed, some of our problems are due to democracy, but I want to make a very important point here. Look around the world. Let's just get our head out of the problems that we see in our country. Look around the world. There are billions of people who want what we have. Look at the events over the last 5 years of the Arab Spring. Look at the millions of people wanting to migrate to places that have democracy. It's not perfect, but as Churchill said, it is the least bad system. He said, all the other systems other than democracy, no, he said, democracy is the worst system of all except for all the other systems that exist. It is natural to have some disdain for democracy because in some ways it has not served us well. In some ways it has. It has empowered lots of people that for centuries did not stand a chance in our country. You saw that picture of mine where I was shaking hands. Transformation can happen at small and big levels. I was in the Rajya Sabha for 9 years and Lok Sabha for 7 years. For 7 years, I must have shaken a couple of million hands. I insist that my constituents either do namaskar or shake my hands, because many of them still try to touch my feet. And I don't allow that. And I don't touch anybody else's feet. And the reason I say you must either do namaskar or shake my hands, and they've begun to love shaking my hands, is it sends a subtle message. Because we still have lingering elements of the caste system. Now, shaking hands is not an Indian custom, but I think it serves a purpose. It sends a message that is a subtext. To come back to democracy, many people have been empowered by democracy, but our democracy has not given us everything that we want or need as a country. So let's take a look, compare with China, the other big, large country in the world that is not democratic and has had many economic successes. Go back to 1980. We roughly had the same per capita income, China and India. And today, the Chinese economy is 5.5 times bigger than the Indian economy. And it was because, as a non-democracy, they could turn the ship around very radically to choose market-friendly policies, mercantilist policies, and grow their economy so dramatically over 3.5 decades. But it's quite clear that while we may take time to get there, our trajectory is also improving. From the so-called Hindu rate of growth of 3 to 3.5% of the 1960s, to the 4 to 4.5% growth rate of the 1980s, to the 6.5% growth rate of the 1990s, we went up in the early 2000s, and one quarter we touched 10% growth rate. And we then came down and we are back up again at 7% plus. But clearly, we may be slower, but democracies have the ability to keep high growth rates if we can get our act together, if we can make some of these transformations happen. Now, I want to start, since we have Mr. Krishnamurthy here with us, on electoral reform. I'm going to talk about 3 key issues. I'm going to talk about parliamentary reform, electoral reform, judicial reform, and I want to touch upon one of my passions, universal basic income. I don't think I'll have time to do more. If you give a microphone to a politician and a large audience, we could be here till breakfast tomorrow. And I have enough issues that I could talk about. I wouldn't be a good politician if I didn't use this to market a little bit. So I do urge you to follow me on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, and see some of my op-eds that I write regularly. You'll find these issues that I'm going to talk about, as well as many others that we won't have time to talk about today. I'm passionate about these issues. So electoral reform, Everybody knows that the root cause of corruption in our country, the root cause of black money in our country is because elections are funded. Political careers are funded with that. How do we change that? We've had something happen in Parliament. Will it make a difference? I think yes, it will make a difference, but it will not eradicate black money. The reduction of anonymous donations from 20,000 rupees cap to 2,000 rupees, they can still claim below 2,000 rupees that anonymous, but it becomes difficult. To show 100 crore rupees received anonymously, you have to claim a large, 10 times larger number of people, and that sometimes may be beyond credibility. The bonds that are coming up, I think it's a good idea. It needs to be explored further. But I'll tell you what is the problem. And I have been writing to the Election Commission for 5 years. I've written to the Law Commission, and I've written op-eds about it. If any of you are interested in political funding cleanup, please read my current month, my op-ed this month in the magazine Swarajya. It's in the February issue. I've written a long, detailed article on it. And I've done a lot of research on this. I'll tell you what the problem is. And I don't talk casually. I've studied other countries' systems. Our problem is that we started off with an idealistic mindset in the 50s because of our founding fathers and mothers being idealists, that money is a bad thing in elections, must be controlled. Not realistic. Elections are not fought on love and free air, love and free air. Elections do need money. And idealism is a great thing, but it must be tempered with pragmatism. So let me justify what I'm saying. Look at other systems. No system is perfect in other democracies, but look at the US. In 2008, a young minority candidate called Barack Obama outspent billionaires, outspent the establishment candidates. How did he do it? He is not a wealthy man. He raised a large number of small donations because he could enthuse millions of people. So, to feel that somebody has a lot of money can come in and disrupt the system, not so simple. Doesn't happen that way in democracies. Take another example again from America. A couple of months ago, Donald Trump won, the first billionaire to ever become president of the US. You'd think his money helped him? Not true. Do you know how much he spent compared to his main competitor, Hillary Clinton? Anybody? Any idea? Half. Trump spent half the amount that Clinton spent. Now, you can complain about his strategy. His strategy was polarizing. His strategy was very radical and rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. You can disagree with that, but don't blame the money. So the attitude that money has to be kept out of elections is the root cause of our problems. What has happened is the money has got pushed under the carpet. We have had limits. The limits were impractical. They've been raised, and now the limits are quite large. But the point is, what ought to be the focus is not how much you spend, but the legitimacy and transparency and traceability of where you get that money. If Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who's made his money legitimately, he's paid taxes on it, and he wants to spend more than normal to run a campaign, I have no problem with it. I have a problem with the holier-than-thou politician who says, I'm a saint, but I get my money from terrorists and drug dealers, and nobody knows how much, and it is under the carpet. I don't have a problem with the amount of money being spent in politics or campaigns. I have a problem with the legitimacy and the traceability of the money. I gave you examples from other countries. That's what we need to focus on. What would I do? I'll just mention briefly, this limit of anonymous donations, I think should go down further to 500 rupees. Some people say, why have any anonymous donations? Why not everything on Paytm? I'll tell you why. You have big rallies, you have 10 lakh people there, it is legitimate. Some people will want to contribute some money. It is not practical to have paperwork and KYC norms at a big rally. People do give. And if you put the limit at 500 rupees, it's legitimate. I'll tell you why. Because it costs you more than 500 rupees per person to organize that rally. You have to organize people, to mobilize them, to arrange food for them at big rallies. That's how politicians run rallies. If you put the anonymous limit cap per donation at 500 rupees, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to cheat, that is. Now, but the biggest problem is this. Biggest problem is people don't pay by check. This bond is a good idea, I think, should be explored further. But the reality is, parties don't audit, they don't keep accounts, and the Election Commission does not have the powers to enforce an audit and to penalize them. I think this is the single biggest flaw in the system. The Election Commission is arguably our most respectable constitutional body. A series of people like Mr. Krishnamurthy, before and after him also, have helped make this a credible. They must be given the powers to enforce audits and to penalize parties for fudging their accounts. Maybe small penalties for minor fudging, major penalties including disqualification of parties and disqualification of candidates for major fudging. That's what must be done. Parties get tax exemption. They should only get tax exemption for traceable, legitimate tax-paid funders. Any money they show has come from somebody who has paid his taxes, earned his money. You people, if you want to donate in check, that money should get tax exemption in the party's hands or the candidate's hands. There should be state funding. People talk about it casually. Let me give you a very specific idea. What is the idea of state funding? Why should tax money be spent on elections? Because democracy is important. Because democracy is important. Don't think so? Go to countries that don't have democracy, stay for a week or two, you'll believe this idea. Now, what does that mean? How should state funding work? Corpus should be created, and my idea is as follows. Please listen to it carefully. The state should give matching funds to parties and candidates to the extent that they raise legitimate funds, with one tweak. Any funds that you raise that are small amounts, let us say up to 5,000 rupees to 10,000 rupees donation, the state should give you 5 times that amount. You know what that means? It levels the playing field so that small donors have much more power than big corporate donors. So let's say Rajiv and I were to face off against each other, and Rajiv arranges a corporate donation of 1 crore of rupees. Legitimate, tax paid. What I'm proposing is that should be tax exempt in his party's hands, and he should get a matching fund of 1 crore from the state, because it is legitimate. I keep emphasizing legitimacy is much more important. But if I raise the same 5 crores, not by one check, but by many checks of 5,000 rupees each, then I should get 5 times matching fund from the state corpus. This is an idea I have taken from New York City. They do it this way. They give you a disproportionate matching fund for small donors. This is how Obama, who raised a lot of $10 and $20 donations, could outspend people that had hundreds of millions of dollars of their own money. So I don't have time to go into it in more detail. Please do check out some of my writing. But this is crucial, I think, that what is important is not the amount that is spent on elections, but the legitimacy. And by taking the measures that I'm proposing, you will create a level playing field between wealth on one hand and popularity on the other hand. Because the real worry we should have is that popular, average Aam Aadmi candidates will get outspent and they cannot get elected. But if you are popular, you should be able to get a lot of people to give you 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 rupees. And if the state gives you 5 times of matching funds, then you have a leverage. You should leverage small donations, and the state funding should empower that. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Please do read some of my articles for more details. I can answer in Q&A also. Let's go to democracy and parliamentary reform. The disruption that you see in Parliament, you think, and most people think, is because we have scoundrels there. We have some scoundrels, but that is really not the fundamental problem. I have spent my 17 years in Parliament trying to behave as an outsider, looking at the fundamentals of what is wrong and how to change things. It's a lot of the commentary that we see, whether it is about parliamentary reform, electoral reform, anything else, is very superficial. Everybody is looking at the symptoms, at the behavior. What we need to change, as an economist would say, is the underlying systemic incentives. If you look at the symptoms and try to treat it, you'll never solve the problem. You have to look for the underlying systemic incentives and change that. It will change. The same people who create a ruckus in Parliament, they come outside and we all sit together and have coffee, they're perfectly decent people. They are. You need to change the system. You need to have transformational rebooting of the incentives. Let me tell you what our problem is. We have a real democracy. We got democracy 70 years ago. And it's real. Elections do work in our country. But we actually got Parliament almost 30 years before independence, because the freedom movement was becoming so much of a pressure point that the British Raj had to yield, and they created a Parliament. But that Parliament was designed not to give full power to those who were there. The Parliament was designed as a place to mouth off, to vent off. And it had certain rules that we still carry today, which are bizarre. And that creates some of the problems. First of all, let me tell you about some of the rules which people don't think about. We are the only parliament in the world, only democracy in the world, where after we pass a bill in both houses, after that bill is signed by the president and should become a law, the government is not required to implement it. It's bizarre. Every other country in the world, whatever system, bicameral, unicameral, once it is passed by the parliament and the head of state signs it, it is law. You've seen all these signing ceremonies of Trump with, of course, these are executive orders, these are not bills, but when the president in that country or prime ministers in other countries, they get their bills turned into acts, they are law. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a workplace sexual harassment law that was passed. Both houses was signed by the president. And the government of the day sat on it for 7 months. And during that time, there was a very infamous case of a workplace sexual harassment. You might remember it about 3-4 years ago. I have moved a private member's bill that after the president signs a bill into act, the government of the day has to implement it in 90 days. Why do we have so much disruption? Because our system is based on a 19th century UK convention that the agenda of the day will be decided by consensus. Made sense when you had 2 parties. It doesn't make sense when you have 40 parties. You know what that means? What is to be discussed today in Parliament? What is to be discussed next Thursday in Parliament? You have to have consensus among 40 parties. That means everybody has a veto. Somebody wants to discuss violence in a state, the regional leader of that state doesn't want to discuss violence in that state. Somebody wants to discuss inflation. Maybe government of the day doesn't want to discuss inflation. So everybody has a veto. It cannot work. Now, Mumbai 100 years ago or 80 years ago did not need traffic lights. You had fewer cars, people came, they adjusted, and they went past. Today, if you don't have traffic lights, can your traffic function outside here? Actually, today it wasn't functioning even with traffic lights, but that's a different story. My point is this. My point is, when times change, you must change the system of managing the traffic. If you have 40 parties, you have to have rules-based. Every other parliament in the world has become rules-based. So in the UK, you have a system. If 40 MPs sign that we want to discuss, let us say, inflation, then it must be discussed. No discretion to anybody. Now, in our system, we often hear speaker's discretion. Actually, what we have is, we have a thick rule book, and the rule book only has one rule. Every other rule that sounds like a rule is not a rule. Let me explain. There is one rule. If 50 MPs in India want to have a no confidence motion, they can have it. That's the only rule. 50 MPs have to sign, speaker can't stop them, nobody can stop them. For every other motion, whether you want to discuss something, or you want to have a voting discussion, or you want to have a short duration discussion, there are a list of rules. All the rules says the following. Every rule says 3 MPs have to request. After that, speaker decides in consultation with Business Advisory Committee, which is these 40 parties. So every rule is 3 people can request, but 40 parties have to agree. Doesn't work. All other countries have changed it. The UK has something else that's very interesting. One day of the week is reserved for opposition days. Within opposition members of parliament, they have a ballot, and they decide, we want to discuss this issue on Thursday, and they discuss it. This is something I'm supporting. And I'm supporting a very clear rules-based system of agenda setting in Parliament. We should make the no confidence motion, we should raise the requirement from 50 MPs to 150 MPs. Because remember, to have a real no confidence, you need 272 votes. Remember, 272 is little more than half of 543 Lok Sabha members. So if you need 272, why be frivolous and say only 50 MPs sign, then you can have no confidence motion and horse trading? What you should have is, in my opinion, 150 MPs should be required to sign, because if you don't have 150 MPs, why bother with a no confidence motion and the horse trading that accompanies it? Because you need 272. And I'm saying at a lower level, you should have 50 MPs to sign to discuss anything non-voting, no discretion of any party, no veto by any party. If 50 MPs, Rajiv and I want to discuss inflation, we get another 48 of our MPs together, we sign it, should be discussed. And to have a voting discussion, it should be 100 MPs. Last session was stuck because whether on demonetization you should have a voting discussion or a non-voting discussion. Opposition wanted to legitimately embarrass the government by having a voting discussion and show that even some of the allies of government were voting against the government. Opposition and government legitimately did not agree, because why should they? There is no such rule. There should be such rules. 50 members to discuss a non-voting discussion and 100 members to have a voting discussion. But there's a lot of things that we can do in Parliament to change Parliament, to change the systemic incentives that would make Parliament function better. Two other things I want to mention before I wind up is judiciary reform. It is the crux of the issue that if the judiciary is stuck in this traffic jam that we have today, the rest of the country will suffer. Every aspect will suffer. Politics will suffer, economics will suffer. There will be no contract enforcement. People in the line of work that we are seeing here today, the stock exchange, all of it will suffer if we cannot have judiciary operating efficiently. There has been a PhD level study in a European university which shows that if India's judiciary were to be made efficient, the GDP would grow an extra 2% annually. That's a very big number. 2% annually extra growth is very big, because predictability and efficient time frames are very crucial. Now, we have the only judiciary in the world which is self-appointing in the higher judiciary. No other judiciary in the world, nowhere is it self-appointing. I have high respect for our judiciary. They've served a good purpose, and the reason it became self-appointing was also correct for that time. It became self-appointed because in the 1970s and 80s, the political dispensation tried to bulldoze the judiciary. And the judiciary reacted by saying that it must be independent, and so we will not allow politicians to appoint us, and it became self-appointing. It served the purpose of that time. It doesn't serve the purpose of our time today. The collegium system has been criticized by judges themselves. There is nepotism, there is inefficiency, and it doesn't help that we have a ratio of judges to people which is one of the lowest in the world. We have only 13 judges at all levels per million population. And the developed countries have between 50 to 100 judges per million population. We need to make dramatic changes. The NJAC, the National Judicial Appointments Commission, which had been put up in Parliament in 2015, was struck down by the Supreme Court, which I think was a tragedy, because it is one example where all parties came together. And it was modeled on the UK Judicial Appointments Commission, which is very fair. And it's ironic that here also, it was a check and balance system that was put in. It was not this government was appointing. You had a government nominee, you had opposition nominee, and you had the Chief Justice and his nominees. In fact, the judges actually had enough on the board to have a veto. That means even if government and opposition got together, they could not bulldoze and appoint a judge. It would require government, opposition, and some members of the judges to agree. And even that they did not agree. So I think it becomes difficult. when the judiciary itself is not open to reforming. But we need drastic reform, otherwise this country, despite every other aspect, is going to suffer on many counts. Two ideas I have proposed is to have fast-track courts for crimes against women and to have allegations against politicians, sitting politicians. So the Supreme Court did a very good thing, which we politicians were not doing, is to disqualify a sitting MP or MLA who becomes convicted. But that conviction process takes sometimes decades. And fast-track courts do actually work. It's ironic, fast-track courts were started about 14, 15 years ago, and the central government stopped funding many of them. Some states have continued with their own funding, like in Odisha and my state. The track record is far, far better. They're quite rigidly tuned to not having more than 3 adjournments. Whereas despite many efforts, our standard judiciary keeps on giving adjournment after adjournment, and cases drag on for decades. So if you look at the statistics and you look at the track record, fast-track courts do actually work. And if you can do 2-3 areas, such as crimes against women and allegations against sitting elected politicians, this will have a disproportionately good effect. Some people say, why should you have fast-track courts for only these 2 areas? Because cleaning up these 2 areas is going to have a tremendously disproportionate good effect on the rest of the country, on politics, on economics, on cleanliness in public life. My final point I wish to make before I wind up is, what radical ideas are we going to think of? I'm sure Rajiv will add his share of radical ideas. One idea that's getting a lot of been writing about it for some months is called a universal basic income, UBI. And what it says is, this actually has originated elsewhere, that automation and technology is going to destroy a lot of jobs. And you can see that today. Today we have 7.1% growth rate in India, but the job creation is much less than when we had 7% earlier. The reason is, 20 years ago, late 90s, if you had 7.1% growth rate, you would get a certain number of jobs created. Today, with 7.1% growth rate, you will not have the same number of jobs created because of automation, because you don't have travel agents anymore. So any travel business that contributes to the 7.1% is not creating travel agency jobs anymore, because you do it online with your app. Things like that. The World Bank has estimated that 68% of Indian jobs today are at risk of being eliminated in the coming decades. Now, how would it work if you give a basic income to poor people? It has been, is getting enormous support from economists, and particularly economists of Indian origin at London School of Economics, at Oxford, in the US. It is being questioned by some for the following reason, that will it get people to lose their incentive to work? Well, yes, if you give a very large, if you give them a 1 lakh rupees income per month, perhaps. But what is being talked about is 1,000 rupees per month for the really poor, just to keep you out of destitution. And the reason why it should be considered is what we have today, all these big programs like Narega and a lot of other subsidy programs, doesn't actually help the people, because the leakage is enormous. I'm going to conclude with this. You remember the late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's famous comment in the 1980s, that of every rupee spent by the government, only 15 paisa reaches the citizen. Do you know how much that has changed? The latest evidence of about 5 years ago from the then Planning Commission about PDS, food distribution, said that only 27 paisa reaches. Out of every rupee that the government spends on the subsidy, 73 paisa goes in salaries, wages, and corruption. 27 paisa reaches. Today it is possible to deliver 1,000 rupees straight to the poorest of the poor, to keep them out of destitution. And there your administration cost and leakage will be far, 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 far lower than 73%. And that is something that we ought to be looking at as a transformational idea. We can discuss more about this in Q&A. I hope I've given you some food for thought. The UBI idea, by the way, The Economist magazine, which is capitalism headquarters, had been opposing it until last week. Do read its current issue, this week's issue. It has come out with a very strong, ringing endorsement that India's fiscal numbers make sense to have UBI for India. I hope I've given you food for thought and look forward to question and answer later on. Thank you very much.